All right. Happy Friday. We made it. Easy week next week. We might have to move my class location next week. It's going to be in my room or next door. I have parent conferences from 10:30 until 2:15, and rather than ask everybody to move their stuff out of my room for parent conferences, I'll probably just pull my class and we'll go next door or next door to Mr. Fernandez. Actually, he's teaching 9:30 next week too, so we'll probably go in the math room next week. But either way, classes will be on Monday and Tuesday. I just don't have middle schoolers here all morning to all day. I have parents coming in and out, so we'll have a regular 2 classes, and then no inquisitive next week, no vocab next week. But you will need to read a chapter for over break for Monday when we come back from Thanksgiving break. Have chapter 13 read for the following month, not this coming Monday, but the following Monday. All right. I want to look at what we're talking about on the board here. We're on slide 3 of slideshow 2, and we're talking about historical context. And I jotted down what this means really is really what the heck's going on at the time of the Transcendentalist movement. We talk about historical context, we're talking about what's going on during the period that we're talking about. And during this Transcendentalist movement that we're referring to, this explosion in literature and focus on nature and individual relationship with God, there's a lot of things that are going on. We touched briefly on it at the end of class yesterday. Early 19th century America was a time of rapid change and growth. There was a lot going on. People were moving in large numbers from farms to cities. Cities were sprouting up all over the United States, up and down the East Coast. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society and the economy. People were, in a lot of ways, people were losing touch with their individuality. People were working in factories, and they were one of maybe hundreds that were working in a factory. Their days and their nights were ruled by bells and whistles and by the clock. And this Transcendentalist movement is a way, I think, that is going to react to that rapid change in lifestyle. And the Transcendentalists would be a group of people who are trying to put the brakes on to the Industrial Revolution, and they're trying to put the brakes on these rapid changes that are happening in society. And they're saying, let's kind of stop and smell the flowers. Let's kind of stop and appreciate things. And let's not get too consumed with productivity, with consumerism. The idea that people were now in a culture in which everyday people could now buy consumer goods at a time where before maybe not everybody had the access to buying large-scale consumer goods. Westward expansion was also reshaping the nation's geography, and religious revivals were sweeping the country. So all this stuff is happening while the Transcendentalists are kind of doing their thing. And the Transcendentalists are going to be headquartered in an area nearby Boston. Not all of them, but a lot of the great Transcendentalist thinkers will be near Boston, Massachusetts. And they're going to be addressing in their meetings and in their writings and in their novels and in their poetry, they're going to be addressing a lot of these items that we're talking about. I mentioned yesterday the Transcendentalist movement was a reaction to what was going on in the country at the time in terms of industry and in terms of manufacturing. The Transcendentalists were hoping that people would take a breath and start to appreciate individuality, to not necessarily feel they have to go along with everyone else in society, to not feel that they all had to work in a factory and spew out oodles and oodles of manufactured goods on an assembly line in a factory situation. The Transcendentalists would, there was a saying among one of the most famous Transcendentalists, Transcendentalists, okay, I'm match today, right? Transcendentalists would say that people should march to the beat of their own drum. They should not necessarily follow along like good little sheep. They should be encouraged to kind of do their own thing. So the transcendentalists are going to be important in that they're offering another way forward in a changing and oftentimes dramatically changing landscape, both a physical landscape and a cultural landscape, a political landscape. The transcendentalists are going to focus a lot on art, okay? And I don't mean art like just literature. Literature is going to be a big part of it, but there's going to be a lot of transcendentalists who are going to focus on paintings and drawings and sculpture as a way of kind of connecting with what's going on in the movement. Some beautiful artwork is going to be produced in this period. A lot of it will be produced in our area, in the Hudson Valley, New York State's Hudson Valley region. So just be aware of what's going on when we talk about the transcendentalists. It's not happening in isolation. There's a lot of things going on in the background that are kind of pushing these transcendentalists into their beliefs. They don't. If you ask the transcendentalists, they would not be very happy. They would not be terribly happy or content with the status of the United States during the Industrial Revolution. And this movement was kind of a way for them to vent, a way for them to offer another way forward. All right. On that note, let's go to our next slide on the intellectual roots. Where does the transcendentalist movement come from? Well, it was influenced by European romantics and German idealists. And it drew a lot of inspiration from ancient Eastern philosophies. Ancient Eastern philosophies. Asian. The transcendentalists rejected strict Puritan traditions and rigid Enlightenment rationalism. They were not so much about strict organized religion like the Puritans were. And this is what's kind of unique, because where the transcendentalists emerged outside of Boston, right near Lexington and Concord, where a lot of them emerged, they are emerging in a part of Massachusetts that before, during the colonial period, was one of the most strict and one of the most organized religious groups in the country at the time, in the colonies, and that is the Puritan colony of Massachusetts. Very strict, very rigid, very doctrinal in their relationship between people who practice the faith and the church. So it's emerging in an area where religion up to that point had often been very, very conservative. Okay, and they're coming out as a group of people who are rejecting the Puritan tradition. The idea that the Puritans, the idea that you had to really, really, really work hard in order to achieve salvation, that you had to, Puritans believed that if you worked real hard and you spent your life working, eventually you would be rewarded. The transcendentalists are going to reject that, and they're also going to reject the Enlightenment ideas that focus just on science as a way of explaining everything. The transcendentalists are, it's not that they reject science as much as they're saying that there's answers to questions that haven't been answered that science can't answer. For example, I'll give you a one that probably was very common among transcendentalists. What is the nature of human beings? What is the nature of man? What is the nature of woman? Okay? Now that's a question, if you think about it in 2024, that's a kind of an open-ended question. What is the nature of human beings? The transcendentalists wanted to debate, they wanted to discuss, and they wanted to find out the answer to that question. It's something a scientific formula from the Enlightenment era is really not going to be able to provide a definitive answer to. So the transcendentalists were relying on more than just science to answer the questions that they were asking. They wanted to use the mind. They wanted to use their mind, and they wanted to use spirituality. They wanted to understand nature. If you were a transcendentalist, a huge part of your belief system would have been communing with nature, trying to be one with nature, maybe living outside. And we're going to take a look in a moment at somebody who will do this. Somebody, Walden, and Henry David Thoreau will spend literally years living in isolation in Walden Pond in Massachusetts, right near Lexington and Concord, and he did that intentionally. He did it intentionally. He lived literally in a shack, probably a quarter the size of this classroom. And he did that intentionally to kind of get down to the basics of living simply and living without a lot of extravagance and without a lot of the creature comforts and without a lot of the outside noise. Transcendentalists they found God in nature every day. They found God in nature every day. They sought a new understanding of spirituality and human potential in a way that you weren't going to see people practicing in a traditional church. I don't want to overwhelm you with transcendentalists. There's not going to be a lot on the Regents, but it's important as you kind of move forward, if colleges in your future, transcendentalism and this whole movement is important because it's like a counterculture movement to the Industrial Revolution, and it's important for that regard. It was a movement, a protest movement, kind of, sort of, if you will, to what was going on in the country at a lot of the times when people were losing track of their individuality and people were losing track of their roots. The transcendentalists would reject the American push toward mass production and industry. Matter of fact, transcendentalists would argue that industry was ruining a lot of the natural beauty of the young nation. Transcendentalists argue that a lot of the big cities that were developing were eyesores, and the problems that came along with large cities, the pollution, the sickness and disease, a lot of these things were things that the transcendentalists looked at and said, this is not our destiny. This should not be something that we should hold up as what we want to accomplish. So in that sense, they were few. There weren't a lot of transcendentalists during this period, but they were very, very influential. They were very influential. Key principles of transcendentalists. What did they believe? Okay? What did they believe? They believed in the inherent goodness of people and in nature. So the question I asked a little while ago, what is the nature of human beings? Transcendentalists, most of them would argue that human beings' inherent nature is goodness, okay? And that nature was good as well. They also believed in self-reliance and individualism. Self-reliance, providing for yourself, not counting on others to provide for you, but providing for yourself, and individualism, following your own path, not being persuaded by, we call it peer pressure today. I'm sure they didn't call it peer pressure, but not feeling like you had to follow the path of so many other people that lived during your time period. They stressed individualism and self-reliance. And they also said and believed, this is important, underline this because it's significant, they wanted to emphasize that the divine permeates all aspects of nature and humanity. In other words, if you look for God, you could find God and spirituality anywhere. You could find it in the water. You could find it in the trees. You could find it in the clouds. You could find it in the human heart. You could find it in relationships. The idea that the divine permeates all of nature and humanity, and they also place an emphasis on intuition over reason. Intuition, going with your gut, and not necessarily following a formula or following a scientific equation to arrive at a conclusion. Going with your gut. Does something feel right? Does something benefit you in a way that is going to enrich your lives? Don't necessarily rely on science and reason to answer that question. Follow your heart, a transcendentalist would say. Follow your heart and go where your heart leads you. These are deep topics, okay, but they're important topics to talk about because these people are going to spend a lot of their time writing about these experiences and writing about their feelings. And some of the literature that will be produced in this period is going to be some of the most enduring literature in American history. A lot of the literature that these people produce, Thoreau, Emerson, Browning, a lot of these people are going to produce some of the most significant literature, and it endures. It's still read today. It's widely read today. So while there weren't a lot of transcendentalists, they certainly had a vast influence over American culture and society. All right. I look at this one and I see, I wouldn't consider myself a transcendentalist, but I will tell you this: when I see a sunny sky, or when I see a beautiful body of water, or a bird flying through the sky, I often look at that and see that as evidence of a wonderful God. We have a world, a natural world around us that, if you stop and take a look at it, and have a quiet moment while you're doing it, we all can appreciate. We all can appreciate, if we look for things to appreciate, the things that we are blessed with in our natural world. And I think that's what the transcendentalists would probably say too. Take a moment to look at the world around you and enjoy it and soak it in for just what it is, a thing of beauty. Don't necessarily try to explain it to people. Don't necessarily think like you have to figure it out. Just kind of absorb it. A blue sky, a beautiful sunset, a full moon. Okay, transcendentalists would say, take notice of these things and appreciate them, because they are evidence, they would believe, of God and God's beauty. All right. Questions on transcendentalism? Anybody? All right. Let's move forward. Ralph Waldo Emerson, probably the biggest of the bunch. Okay. He published a book called Nature in 1836, and this is the Transcendentalist Bible in a sense. It's the gold standard for transcendentalists. He gave his divinity school address 2 years later, in 1838, challenging traditional religious views. And as you might imagine, transcendentalists, how do you think organized religions tended to treat or speak or to react toward transcendentalists? Like, you're talking Catholic Church, some Protestant church. How do you think, Katie, they reacted?
Not very well.
Yeah.
They probably blindsided. Like blindsided.
Yeah, they probably felt that these people were crackpots, that they really didn't have a right speaking about God in a way that maybe the Protestant church or the Catholic church wasn't speaking about. They looked at them as radicals. They looked at them as people who maybe didn't know what they were talking about, or just plain didn't understand religion. So they weren't very popular among other religious groups, but they still were very significant. Ralph Waldo Emerson also founded a transcendental club in 1836, and they would basically sit around people's homes in the neighborhood and debate and discuss and connect with their ideas about religion, their ideas about God, and how society can be shaped to become better if people recognize some of the things that maybe weren't going as well as they had hoped. For example, transcendentalists would remind people that there's more to life than just working in a factory 60 hours a week. People could be blessed to live and work on a farm. People could be blessed to have an opportunity to be home with their family, if they could. People would be blessed to have an opportunity to travel, to live in a way that we would probably call today living off the grid. Transcendentalists were very troubled by the urbanization that was happening during the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of their writing reflects that. Emerson is also going to mentor other transcendentalist thinkers and writers, and there is a cover of a book that's got some of his important articles that rather would appeared and from his personal documents. Ralph Waldo Emerson is he's the godfather of the transcendentalist movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Henry David Thoreau and Walden. All right, so we get to the point where this gets kind of interesting. Henry David Thoreau and Walden. Now, Walden is a pond over near Lexington and Concord, outside of Boston. Okay, birthplace of the American Revolution, you might remember. Thoreau lived in a cabin at Walden Pond for 2 years, starting in 1845. And when I say cabin, it was pretty primitive. I'll see if I can find a picture of it. It was very, very tiny. It cost him about $12 to build it, and it was very, very simple. And he wrote Walden while there to share his experiences and his philosophy. How many do you guys have Mr. Mahalik? You'll have him next year. Okay, he is a Walden aficionado. He is a Walden Pond expert, and if you ask him about it, he'll tell you about it. When he writes Walden, he shared his experiences and his philosophies. Thoreau did. He emphasized simple living and connection with nature. He took walks every day around Walden Pond. He scribbled notes about what he saw. He wrote about the wildlife. He wrote about the flowers. He wrote about the fauna, the leaves. He wrote about the seasons. All right. He also wrote a paper called Civil Disobedience, Influencing Future Social Movements. Henry David Thoreau was an activist, and a political activist in a sense. And if you look at the title of his paper here, Civil Disobedience, what is it? Somebody tell me what that means, civil disobedience.
If you disagree with the law, then you just don't follow it.
Yeah, it's basically peacefully disobeying laws that you feel are immoral. Disobeying laws that you feel are immoral, and civil disobedience is, if you look at some of the people that will come after Thoreau that practice civil disobedience, they're pretty influential people. Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa. Okay, you got Jesus was actually probably the first practitioner of civil disobedience, disobeying laws peacefully, non-violently, but doing it to bring attention to an issue. And Henry David Thoreau was clearly in that camp, disobeying laws that he felt were immoral or that he felt were wrong. All right. His experience there and the things that he wrote about while at Walden were, again, monumental in American literature. If the number of people who were transcendentalists were the same as the number of people who have read Walden after he's died, okay, there would have never been a problem with transcendentalism catching on in the 1830s and 40s, because the number of people that have read Walden Pond and read the story of Henry David Thoreau while he was living there are in the millions. There weren't a million transcendentalists when the movement was emerging. Very, very small number, but it caught on over time. He was very influential. Here's a clip on Walden I want to share with you before we leave today.
I lived alone in the woods a mile from any people, in a house which I built myself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. I have thus a tight shingled and plastered house, 10 feet wide by 15 feet long and 8-foot posts, with a garret and a closet, a large window on each side, 2 trap doors, 1 door at the end, and a brick fireplace opposite. The exact cost of my house? $28.12 1/2.
And he stayed to record the cycling of the seasons.
The book wheels marvelously through the seasons. He compressed his 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at Walden Pond, in actuality, into one seasonal cycle.
Many people picture Thoreau as the Walden hermit, secluded, doing everything for himself. Not entirely true.
What Walden symbolizes is a balance between civilization and nature. Thoreau didn't move to a primitive landscape when he moved to Walden. It was only 1.5 miles from the village. He had society at his elbow. But he said in Walden, we need the tonic of wildness.
He hosted the Anti-Slavery Society picnic, and he had friends out there, friends who passed through, friends who spent time. He had the animals, but it was essentially him. And that was really the point, because his idea of reform is that you don't reform communities, you don't reform crowds, you reform people.
Reform had to start from within, Thoreau believed. You can't reform your community, you can't reform your town, you can't reform your country unless and until you reform yourself. So this living for 2 months on 2 years and 2 months on his own was designed to allow him to become a better person so he could become a better member of his community, but not until he was made a better person individually.
One at a time, and you reform yourself. And that's really where it begins. It's what the book means, if Walden means anything.
Self-reform required independence from society and the values of expediency. But Thoreau was not disconnected from the larger world. He was kept up to date by friends like the poet Ellery Channing. He supported the local Underground Railroad, which hid runaway slaves. His opposition to slavery even got him thrown into jail for a few hours. And he spent the night in jail simply because the sheriff and tax collector, one Sam Staples, had left for the day and didn't want to be bothered going back. And it wasn't even an original gesture. His neighbor, Bronson Alcott, had set the example 3 years earlier. So why do we still celebrate the night in jail? Again, say the experts, it is the transforming power of his writing. One critic wrote that, as a political warrior, Thoreau was a comic little figure. As a political writer, he was the most ringing and magnificent polemicist America has ever produced.
You might have heard the name of another man there in the video, Alcott. That was the husband, I believe, of Louisa May Alcott, who is famous for writing what novel? Louisa May Alcott wrote the story called Little Women, and she was part of this group of people as well, as was her husband, this transcendentalists. All right, let's move on. A little bit more to go. The role of nature, according to the transcendentalists, saw nature as a source of spiritual truth and inspiration. Okay? The role of nature. They believed in the interconnectedness of all living things. And here is this is a common belief among many people today. The so-called circle of life, the interconnectedness of all living things. Did transcendentalists eat meat? Many of them did. Did they butcher animals? Absolutely. But they understood that there was a connection between all living things that made a very unique situation for all living things. In other words, they valued all living things. And much like Native Americans, who we've learned about when I had you all in 7th grade, much like Native Americans, a thought among the transcendentalists would probably be, a common thought would be, if you're going to use animals to sustain yourself, you should do what with animals? Use it all. Waste not. Waste not. All right? They encourage direct experience with nature for personal growth. So Thoreau, who spent 2 years and 2 months and 2 days at Walden Pond, would encourage others to do the same, to get off the grid. You know, there's a movement afoot today in a lot of communities, in a lot of schools. When you guys started the school year this year, there was a huge, huge controversy over not allowing cell phones in schools. I think one of the reasons that a lot of communities around the country are doing that, or going the way of cell-free schools, is that they want to encourage and interconnectedness with other human beings, with other people, and less of a reliance on the electronic aspect of it. So I see a similarity between that and the transcendentalist belief that you had to experience nature to grow personally. I also believe very strongly that we have to encourage relationships with human beings in order to grow as human beings. We cannot, it's tragic to me that you can walk into a restaurant or a public place or a place where there might be thousands of people, and every one of them, it seems, when I walk into a public setting, is not engaged with another person. They're all engaged on what? Oh my goodness, transcendentalists will be pulling their hair out at that.